Okay, I know what you're thinking. It's been a long time since my last podcast. Yeah, sorry. But things happen. Life gets busy. Also, I've been doing my 2 Marks and a Mike podcast with Mark Allen, so, I'm podcasting. I'm just not necessarily doing this one. Anyway, welcome to Almost a Podcast, the comedy podcast by Marko the Comic, where you get all kinds of wonderful comedy, funny stuff, but this time we're doing something a little different. And by a little different, I mean a lot different. What we're going to do is I have an article on my Substack called Kill or Die, 1 Mic and 200 Years of American Stand-Up. And I thought, not everyone likes to read. Some people hate reading. Why don't I just read it to y'all? Notice how I said y'all? I'm getting real southern over here. Anyway, so that's the plan. And without further ado, let's dive in. Now, the paid subscribers get the full article. Free subscribers get a portion of the article, a preview, and I'm going to do the same thing with the podcast. So if you want the full thing, if the dulcet tones of my voice are lulling you towards that, by all means, give me your money. Thank you. Okay. Without further ado, Kill or Die, 1 Mic and 200 Years of American Stand-Up. From laughter to silence, the comedians who made stand-up comedy what it is today. Stand-up comedy is the only art form in which failure is instantaneous, public, and audible, or inaudible. A novelist who writes a bad book finds out gradually through polite rejection letters and tepid sales. A bad stand-up comedian finds out in real time, from a room full of people who have stopped laughing. The silence after a dead joke is undeniable and painful. That this art form exists at all, that people willingly step into that silence night after night for the chance to make strangers laugh, says something interesting about us and about them. Stand-up comedy is about 160 years old, depending on how you count. It began more or less accidentally with a group of writers who discovered that an audience would pay to watch them talk. It survived vaudeville, radio, the Great Depression, television, the comedy club boom, the internet, and the algorithmically optimized attention economy. It has been declared dead roughly every 15 years since 1960. It keeps not dying. What follows is the story behind the laughter, the comics who made it, the ones who broke the rules, and the occasional ones who were simply asked to leave. Era 1. Before the Brick Wall, 1860s to 1880s. The Yarn Spinners, or How a Road Trip and a Drinking Problem Invented American Comedy. Nobody set out to invent stand-up comedy. It emerged the way most American institutions emerge, out of necessity, improvisation, and a certain amount of shamelessness. In the years after the Civil War, a new kind of entertainment began touring the country, the humorous lecture. It was exactly what it sounded like. A man, almost always a man, would stand before a paying audience and talk. Not preach, not recite poetry, not perform a play, just talk, usually about something nominally topical, but really about whatever he found funny. The audience, starved for entertainment in an era before film, radio, or recorded music, would pay good money to sit in a hall and listen. The godfather of this tradition, the one who rarely gets credit, was Charles Farrar Brown, who performed under the name Artemus Ward. Ward was a newspaper humorist turned lecture performer who built an entire act out of misspellings, malapropisms, and a studied air of sublime confusion. He was also, by most accounts, genuinely hilarious. Not in a way that translates easily to the page, but in the way of someone who understood that the space between what you say and how you say it is where comedy actually lives. He was the first person to turn that space into a professional enterprise. Then came Mark Twain, who absorbed Ward's lessons and improved on them considerably, while also having the good sense to become Mark Twain. Twain's lecture tours of the 1860s and 1870s were events. He had an instinct for timing that contemporaries described in almost supernatural terms, the ability to hold a pause just long enough that the audience wasn't sure if the joke was coming or if they'd missed it. He understood intuitively that the anticipation of the laugh was half the laugh. His famous approach was deceptively simple. He would say something outrageous, then look mildly surprised that it had landed, as if he hadn't quite meant to say it. The persona, the lazy drawl, the studied indifference, the apparent rambling that was in fact precisely controlled, was the first great stand-up character in American history.
Well, there was a man around here in the spring of 49 named Jim Smiley, and he was the most worst man you ever saw about betting on anything. That is, if he could get somebody to bet on the other side, and if he couldn't, he'd change sides. Anything what suited the other man would suit him, just so he got a bet he was satisfied.
The comedy of this era was rooted in the tall tale, the deadpan put-on, and the cracker barrel tradition of rural American storytelling. It was often pointed. Twain's humor in particular was always political, even when it appeared to be merely silly. But the sharpest edges were usually wrapped in enough folksy charm that audiences didn't notice they were being criticized until they were already laughing. The stage was bare, there was no microphone. The craft was entirely a matter of voice, timing, and persona. In that sense, nothing has changed. Era 2. Everything's an act. 1880s to 1930s. Vaudeville, when comedy had a train schedule. Vaudeville didn't invent comedy, but it gave comedy a business model, which in America is basically the same thing as inventing it. The vaudeville circuit, organized primarily by promoters like Benjamin Franklin Keith and Edward Albee, grandfather of the playwright, was a national network of theaters connected by rail lines. A performer who made the circuit could work 40 weeks a year, playing a different city every week, earning a reliable paycheck. It was, in its way, the first entertainment industry in the modern sense, standardized, scalable, and slightly ruthless. Comedy on the vaudeville stage was broadly inclusive, in the way that things were inclusive when they were trying to appeal to the largest possible paying audience. The bill typically featured comics, singers, dancers, acrobats, trained animals, and occasionally all of the above simultaneously. The comedian had maybe 15 minutes to make an impression, which concentrated the mind wonderfully. Will Rogers worked with a lasso and a drawl, and a political sensibility so sharp that his observations about Congress could be reprinted in newspapers without a single edit. This country has come to feel the same when Congress is in session as when the baby gets a hold of a hammer.
Don't get scared and start turning off your radios. I'm not advertising or trying to sell you anything. If the mouthwash you're using is not the right kind and it tastes sort of like sheep dip, why, you just have to go right on using it. I can't advise any other kind at all.
W.C. Fields arrived with a juggling act and stayed for decades, his misanthropy ripening into one of the great comic personas of the 20th century. Weber and Fields did ethnic comedy with a physical precision that made you forget momentarily how uncomfortable the material was. But the most important figure in vaudeville comedy was one of the least celebrated outside of circles that know to celebrate him, Bert Williams. Williams was a black comedian born in the Bahamas and raised in California, who became one of the most popular performers in American vaudeville by the early 1900s. His stage persona, slow-moving, put-upon, perpetually defeated by circumstances, was executed with a technical mastery that contemporary observers compared to Chaplin.
Life seems full of clouds and rain, and I am full of nothing and pain. Who soothes my thumping, bumping brain? Nobody.
Booker T. Washington, not a man given to hyperbole, called him the most celebrated black American in the country. He performed in blackface because the industry demanded it of black performers. This was not a personal aesthetic choice. It was the price of admission. Williams later said that it took him 10 years to learn his craft and another 10 to learn how to put on the cork. His presence in vaudeville was a triumph over conditions that would have finished most people, and his absence from most histories of American comedy is an ongoing embarrassment. He belongs in the first sentence of this story.
I don't mind telling you the reason why. I'm just tired of eating in the restaurant, or I'm just nearly starved to death. Why, the very thought of a home-cooked meal just takes away my breath. It does. I done found out that one cook cooks it all, 'cause the food all tastes the same.
And the only difference that there seems to be is every restaurant have a different name, that's all.
So in a different way does Sophie Tucker. Tucker, the last of the Red Hot Mamas, was a Jewish immigrant's daughter from the Lower East Side who built a career out of being too much. Too loud, too brash, too openly sexual, too unapologetically herself. In an era when female performers were expected to be decorative and demure, Tucker was neither, and audiences loved her for it. She understood decades before the term existed that transgression could be a selling point.
Life is a book, so they say, of records on each page. I turned my first leaf when I went upon the stage. The road was rough and it was tough, especially for a girl alone. Heartache, sighing, nights of crying. For my folks at home, why I remember way back when I was a young Connecticut lass. I was just as green as grass, had lots of nerve, no class. And the men I met then, they were some sweet bunch. Said a star they'd make me. Right away they tried to date me, but I had a Yiddish hunch. Then there came a day for a job with pay. I wondered if I'd make it. Only 20 beans, but when you're broke it seems a fortune, and you take it. And then there came along one fine song. I hope you'll never forget to remember me when you hear some of these days.
The style of the era was broad, physical, and built for the back row. Ethnic caricature was common and casual in a way that requires some historical context to properly evaluate. Not excuse, but understand. The performers were often themselves immigrants or the children of immigrants, and the material reflected the cultural anxieties of a country absorbing enormous demographic change. That some of it was ugly is true. That it was also a form of working-class self-expression by people who had few other forms is equally true. What vaudeville gave comedy was structure, pace, and the knowledge that timing was a learnable skill, not an innate gift. The 15-minute slot forced precision. The variety context forced distinctiveness. By the time vaudeville began its slow collapse in the 1920s, done in by radio and then by film, it had trained a generation of performers who would go on to reshape American culture. Era 3. Seltzer and Static. The Borscht Belt, the radio, and the invention of the television personality. In the mountains of New York's Catskill region, about 90 miles from Manhattan, there was for several decades a cluster of Jewish resort hotels that served as the most important comedy laboratory in American history. The Grossingers, the Concord, Kutcher's, Brown's, these were places where working-class Jewish families went on vacation and where comedians went to work. The Borscht Belt, as the circuit was known, was in practice a farm league, a place where you could try new material, bomb without lasting consequences, and learn from the best in a concentrated environment. The audiences were knowledgeable, opinionated, and not inclined to be polite about mediocrity. It was, in other words, excellent training ground. The Jewish comedians who came out of this world brought with them a sensibility that would become the backbone of American comedy. Self-deprecation as armor, wordplay as sport, a deep suspicion of pomposity, and the ability to find the absurd in suffering. Comedy as a survival mechanism, refined over centuries of history that made survival genuinely necessary. Jack Benny constructed comedy out of character and silence. His radio persona, the cheap, vain, perpetually 39-year-old miser, was sustained across decades with a consistency that amounted to a kind of genius. The famous "your money or your life" bit, in which Benny pauses for so long after the robbery demand that the studio audience begins laughing before the punchline even arrives, is still one of the greatest single moments in the history of American comedy. The pause is the joke. The character makes the pause believable.
Hey, Bud. Bud.
Huh?
Got a match?
Match? Yes, I have one right here.
Don't make a move. This is a stick-up.
What?
You heard me.
Mister, put down that gun.
Shut up. Now, come on. Your money or your life? Look, Bud, I said your money or your life. I'm thinking it over.
George Burns and Gracie Allen invented banter. Not the kind where two people trade quips, the kind where one person's impeccable logic and one person's apparent illogic somehow produce together a picture of the world that is more accurate than either one alone. Allen's comic persona was often described as dumb, which fundamentally misunderstands what she was doing. She was applying rigorous consistency to premises that didn't deserve it, and Burns was the straight man, patient enough to let her fly.
Look, George. He's kissing her anyway. That lad never takes no for an answer. Oh, there's the end of the picture. Let's stay and see it again, George.
Gracie, we've been here since noon. We've seen the picture 3 times. I want to get home and listen to Vox Pop.
But Alan Ladd looks so wonderful in this picture. You know, he seems to look older.
We all look older. We've been here 6 hours.
Milton Berle was television. Not a television performer, television itself, in human form. When NBC launched Texaco Star Theater in 1948, with Berle as host, appliance stores reported selling television sets at a rate they had never seen. The joke was that America bought televisions specifically to watch Berle, and the joke was mostly accurate. He was big and broad and relentless, a vaudevillian turned into something new by the intimacy of the small screen. Bob Hope, who was not Jewish but who had absorbed the Borscht Belt rhythms through cultural osmosis, was the era's great machine. Disciplined, prolific, a master of the one-liner, delivered at a tempo that left no room for silence. Hope's comedy was comfortable. It confirmed rather than challenged, reassured rather than disturbed. This made him enormously popular and, in the long run, somewhat limiting as an influence. Henny Youngman gave the world, "Take my wife, please," which is as close to a perfect joke as the English language has produced. The setup implies one thing, the pause implies something else, and the punchline delivers a third thing while appearing to complete the first. The whole journey takes 4 words. It is the haiku of American comedy.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I'm so happy to be here tonight, even at this salary. 2 gamblers coming out of church. One says, "Look, it's hallelujah, not hialeah." A drunk walks up to a parking meter, puts a dime in, the arrow goes to 60. He says, "Yeah, I lost 100 pounds. Say a drunk is brought into court. The judge says, "My good man, you've been brought here for drinking." He says, "All right, Judge, let's get started."
Sid Caesar, largely forgotten outside of comedy nerd circles, was perhaps the most technically gifted performer of the era, an actor who could do dialects, characters, and physical comedy at a level that left contemporaries stunned. The writers he assembled for Your Show of Shows included Mel Brooks, Neil Simon, Larry Gelbart, Carl Reiner, and Woody Allen. That sentence alone explains a significant percentage of American comedy for the next 40 years. This is the era in which the structure of the joke, setup, pause, punchline, becomes codified into something close to a science. It is the era that establishes the rhythm that all subsequent comedians will either follow or fight against. Era 4, low ceilings, high stakes, 1950s to 1960s. 2 drinks minimum, 1 subpoena. In 1958, a comedy album called The Button-Down Mind of Bob Newhart sold more than 1 million copies and won the Grammy for Album of the Year, beating, among other things, an album by Frank Sinatra. This tells you something about how far comedy had traveled from the hotel ballrooms of the Catskills. The comedy club had arrived. Small, smoky rooms with low ceilings and a 2-drink minimum, scattered across San Francisco and New York and a handful of other cities that fancied themselves sophisticated. The Hungry Eye in North Beach, the Village Vanguard in Greenwich Village, the Bitter End. These were not places for trained seals. They were places where a comedian could work slowly, quietly, in front of an audience that had come specifically to listen. The comedy album arrived with the club, and the two together created something new. A comedy culture that existed independently of television, that didn't need the approval of network censors, and that could reach audiences who would never see a live performance.
This is a telephone conversation between Abe and his press agent just before Gettysburg. Hi, Abe, sweetheart, how are you, kid? How's Gettysburg? Sort of a drag, huh? Well, Abe, you know them small Pennsylvania towns. You seen one, you seen them all. Right. Listen, Abe, I got the note. What's the problem? You're thinking of shaving it off. Abe, don't you see that's part of the image? Right, with the shawl and the stovepipe hat, the string tie. Where's the shawl, Abe? You left it in Washington. What are you wearing, Abe? A sort of cardigan? Abe, don't you see that doesn't fit with the string tie and the beard? Abe, would you leave the beard on and get the shawl, huh?
Newhart's deadpan phone call monologues, Shelley Berman's anxious urban observations, Jonathan Winter's inspired lunacy, these reached people through their record players, building audiences that felt, correctly, like they were in on something. But the era's most consequential figure was not a gentle ironist. He was a small, intense man from Brooklyn who couldn't stop talking about the things you weren't supposed to talk about. Lenny Bruce is the hinge point of American stand-up comedy. Before him, the contract between comedian and audience was essentially, I will entertain you without disturbing you. Bruce tore that contract up. He talked about race, religion, sex, drugs, and the corruption of language itself, not for shock value per se, but because he believed that language and power were inseparable and that comedy was the most honest available tool for examining both. He was arrested multiple times for obscenity. He spent the last years of his life more or less consumed by his own legal cases, accumulating prosecution documents and performing increasingly erratic sets that were as much legal briefings as comedy. He died of a morphine overdose in 1966 at 40, found on his bathroom floor. New York State gave him a posthumous pardon in 2003, which is exactly the kind of closing bit he would have appreciated.
I think that a lot of marriages went west, they went split up in my generation because ladies didn't know that guys were different. I mean, different. It's very tough for chicks to realize that although we speak the same language, that you can have babies. It's different. It's like no guy ever cheated on his wife, ever. But ladies would get hurt and want to leave the husband because they thought the husbands cheated, and they never did cheat. Because what cheating means, I know. To a lady, means kissing and hugging and liking somebody. You have to at least like somebody. Guys, that doesn't enter into it all the time. No. Ladies are one emotion, and guys detach. Not consciously detach, but they just do detach. Like a lady can't go through a plate glass window and go to bed with you 5 seconds later. But guys can have head-on collisions with Greyhound buses in disaster areas. Everybody's laying dead on the highway. Not only the hospital, in the ambulance, the guy makes play for the nurse. How could he do a thing at a time like that? Oh, I got horny. The what? I got hot. How could you be hot when your foot was cut off and you're dead? I don't know. He's an animal! He got hot with his foot cut off. I guess I'm an animal. What did you get hot at? The nurse's uniform. It's a moron, that's all. He's just an animal. No, it's guys detach and has nothing to do with them liking, loving. You put guys on a desert island, they'll do it to mud. Mud. So if you caught your husband with mud, somehow you could get overseas there. Mud! Don't talk to me, that's all. You piece of shit, you leave me alone, that's all. Go with your mud, have fun. You want dinner, get your mud to make dinner for you, that's all.
His importance is difficult to overstate. He didn't just push the boundaries of what was permissible. He made the question of permissibility itself into a subject for comedy. Every comedian who has ever stood on stage and said something they were told they couldn't say owes something to Lenny Bruce. Mort Saul arrived around the same time carrying a rolled-up newspaper and a monologue full of political observations so sharp that Eisenhower's press secretary reportedly kept him updated on administration policy specifically so Saul could make accurate jokes about it. Saul invented the political comedian as a recognizable archetype, the intellectual, the skeptic, the person who reads too much and doesn't trust anyone in office. Dick Gregory got there by a different route. Gregory was the first black comedian to cross over to white mainstream audiences, and he did it by talking openly about race at a time when this was not considered good career strategy. His appearances on Jack Parr's Tonight Show in 1961 are worth finding and watching. He is sitting there in 1961 making white television audiences laugh at jokes about American racism with a composure that is either saintly or simply the only practical option available. Probably both.
If I was young enough to get drafted, I'd wait till I got my induction notice, then show up in the draft board, and they give you that little questionnaire to fill out. And when they got to that little section that said occupation, I would just write murderer. That sounds funny, but you know, we got such dumb laws in this country, we would never be permitted by law to draft a murderer into the army to send him to Vietnam to kill Viet Cong.
Phyllis Diller belongs in this company. Her act, the frantic self-deprecation, the wild hair, the cigarette holder, the fang jokes, appears on the surface to be a woman agreeing with every bad thing society wanted to say about her. Look closer and it's something else entirely. A woman systematically destroying every expectation of femininity through the mechanism of comedy, laughing last and making a very good living doing it. She was not a victim of the form, she was using it. What this era understood collectively is that comedy could be an honest art, that you could use it to tell the truth, to challenge power, to say the thing that couldn't be said any other way. That understanding is the inheritance that makes everything after it possible. Era 5, the ones who meant it, 1965 to 1980. Truth, Consequences, and Richard Pryor. Every art form has a before and after. For stand-up, the before and after is Richard Pryor. And this is where paid subscribers get the rest of the article, and the free ones get booted out. Sorry, free people.